So I have these introductions which I'm going to use, but each of these people is really just has a very warm place in many of our hearts as guiding spirits in this project, and that's really my main introduction. But otherwise, I will tell you where they teach. But we wanted their special voices in here to give us a few insights at the end, or a wrap up, or a reflection for a conference that's very hard to summarize. So Nadav Orian Peer is an assistant professor at Tulane, a visiting assistant professor at Tulane Law School. His scholarship and teaching focus on the law of financial institutions, international finance, and community development. Before joining the faculty at Tulane, he was a business economist at the Federal Reserve in Chicago, and he completed his SJD in law here at Harvard. Patricia Mccoy teaches at Boston College Law School, where she's the inaugural Liberty Mutual Insurance Professor of Law. In 2010 and 11, she joined the U.S. Department of the Treasury, where she helped form the new Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and she'll have to go back and reform it in the next administration.
We're working on it.
Yeah. She's the author of several books and also wrote a striking article, A Tale of Three Markets, in the Texas Law Review, where she was among the first to raise alarms about the danger of subprime loans. Turns out she was right. Saule Omarova teaches regulation of financial institutions, banking law, international finance, and corporate finance at Cornell Law School. She has a PhD in political science as well as a JD, private practice experience in corporate transactions and financial regulation. In 2006 and 2007, she served at the U.S. Department of Treasury as a special advisor for regulatory policy to the Undersecretary for Domestic Finance. Iain Frame teaches law at Kent Law School in Canterbury, in UK. He has an SJD from this school, and his research draws on insights from American legal realism to analyze the ways that the rules of property, contract, and negotiable instruments shaped the structure of money and banking in England and Scotland during the 18th and 19th century. So I'll leave it to them.
I think I'm up first. Thank you very much, Chris. And can I just start by saying that it's been an immense privilege to be here and to benefit from the papers that were circulated beforehand and also the presentations that so many of you have given. I've learnt a huge amount from that. We've been asked to identify themes and also comment on next steps. I think I'll spend a bit more time talking about themes and hope that my fellow panelists pick up more on the next steps. In terms of themes, well, there are three that have struck me in particular, and themes are kind of key words that come to mind that have been prominent and powerful over the last 2 days. And as a luck would have it, or for convenience sake, it turns out all three of them start with the letter D, the themes being distribution, design, and decisions. That is what is to be done. And I thought what I would do is just reflect for a few minutes on each of these, thinking that with respect to the question of distribution, we might have got to the point where there's a bit of a consensus. There also is, I think, quite a lot of focus on the issue of design, and indeed, I think yesterday was a bit more focused on distribution. Design has been a theme throughout, and yet decision has perhaps become a really big theme of today's events, yet I'm not so sure there's quite so clear-cut a consensus around the question of what is to be done or the decisions that we have to make. So first of all then, just a word or two on distribution. It came up very, very prominently in the first panel yesterday when in Roy Kreitner's comments, in particular focusing on Katriana Pistor's paper, seeing her paper as building on or trying to add a legal and institutional legal dimension to the research that people like Thomas Piketty have done in recent years, adding a legal angle that focuses on the particular legal institutions and mechanisms, in particular those of private law, that are helping to skew, are contributing towards a skewed distribution of wealth, income, a skewed distribution of the gain a skewed distribution of the benefits of our collective economic endeavours towards, in particular, the top 1%, the top 10%. So distribution was coming very powerfully to the fore in that panel. And in so doing, questions of labour and class were also coming to the surface, since it's labour that's being screwed there to the benefit of capital. And that theme continued very much so in the financialisation panel. It also was very, very prominent in some of the other panels that I attended yesterday on money and morality and on money and economic democracy. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that there's a consensus here, at least in this room, and I think maybe to some extent more broadly, not with everyone. Gregory Mankiw was mentioned in the last panel I was at as someone who doesn't think that skewed benefits towards the top 1% is a problem, but I think there may be a bit of a consensus that that's a problem, that the skewed distribution of income and wealth, the benefits of our collective endeavours is a problem. And it then raises the question of what are we going to do about it, and that is brought into focus, I think, both today and yesterday, this question of design. And I think in particular a lot of the really great work on the question of design is started to focus on this relationship between the state and commercial banks, between public authority and commercial banks, and trying to think through how that relationship works itself out. And I think we've got a lot of fantastic, innovative conceptual work on this that I also think connects into Scott Ferguson's point from earlier about the language that we use to try and help us think about that relationship and how we might design it differently. Thinking of it in terms of a public-private partnership, as a finance franchise, as a task that involves public procurement, as a social contract, all underpinned perhaps or brought to the surface by a constitutional theory of money. And I think highlighting the role that that public authority plays is really very, very important in these conceptual innovations, because I think you could say that one aspect to post-2008 reforms has been, in 2008, we saw very, very clearly the role that public authority is playing in backstopping the financial and monetary system. And one response to that might be to say, that's illegitimate, it ought not to be there. There should be a far more clear division where public authority is kept in a box and banks are left to fail on their own. That if public authority is there backstopping them, what's going to happen to discipline in that scenario? And thinking about moral hazard and being concerned about moral hazard has perhaps driven a great deal of post-crisis reforms rather than embracing that role for public authority. Yet the question of embracing a role for public authority, I think, also brings to the surface the issue of how exactly then are we going to design those arrangements that are captured by that sort of broad headings of a finance franchise or a social contract between banking and the state. And I think with respect to decisions over what it is that we're going to do, there's a bit less clarity here. So we want to work out how to mobilise society's resources. We want to work out who's going to get access to credit, who's not going to not get access to credit. We want to work out things like, it was mentioned yesterday, what is our financial system supposed to do? And then we resort to categories like, well, it's supposed to serve the public purpose, or it's supposed to serve the real economy. Yet in the first panel today and on the financialisation panel yesterday, once we began to probe those categories of what is the public purpose and what is the real economy, these categories looked an awful lot less secure. It became an awful lot harder to work out what it is that we're going to do. Trying to find alternative means of allocating resources gets quite difficult. And I think I can understand why it's a difficult question, or at least I offer a suggestion, that underpinning all of this is property. I think that comes through actually clearly in Professor Pistor's paper from yesterday, presentation from yesterday. And when we're dealing with property, we're dealing with both allocating benefits, entitlements to some, but that's going to have, at the same time, it's going to have a system where we're also exposing others to harm. And when we're allocating benefits to some, we're exposing others to harm. That's involving really quite intense political issues that are full of conflict and are full of difficult choices. And that's perhaps why the questions over the decision of what is to be done are so hard. Just a final thought on the question of what is to be done. One thing that lawyers can be quite good at is turning from those kind of broad categories of, look, there's a finance franchise that's in place here, we should embrace the public authority that underpins that. Then there comes the question, though, of adding the institutional details, the devilish institutional details that we have to kind of work out. And so the presentation from Morgan Ricks earlier and his co-authors, I think, is valuable because it's getting at some of those details. But I think the other source of some of those details about the design and about what that entails for the decisions over who gets how much of what and who can do what to whom are also brought out to life by much of the historical research that many of us here are doing. And I think it's in the historical work in particular that those questions of design and decision come alive and sometimes provoke us into challenging, or provoke us to challenge some of our assumptions that might help us to think through things differently. So I'll end there.
Yes, first of all, I'd like to give a really warm thanks to Chris for what has been just a magnificent conference, and a round of applause. And thanks as well to Nadav and to Susan. This weekend we've had really a cornucopia of very rich proceedings that have, in my mind, provoked a whole stream of thoughts about a couple of things. First of all, about other progressive discourses in law that intersect with the field of this conference, and also about the ability to translate many of the ideas expressed in this conference into action. And so in my wrap-up remarks today, I'd like to venture some thoughts along both lines. As Chris mentioned, I'm a law professor, a former regulator, and at the moment a policy advocate, given the current political circumstances. And I define my field as banking regulation law. Within that field, historically, there have been several other strands of discourse that do intersect with the themes of money and democracy. And many of those strands of discourse are represented in this room, not necessarily all as well. So first are the geographic debates, which have gone on in the US for over 200 years, surrounding the return of deposits to the local communities from which they are taken. And so in the United States, we've had a long, long history until the 1990s of very strict geographical limitations on banking expansion. And then today we see the enshrinement of that debate in the Community Reinvestment Act and in provisions of the Regal-Neal Act from 1994. Another strand of discourse, of course, are fair lending laws and the history leading up to the enactment of those laws. A third are other sources of arguments for public access to financial instruments and to markets. And so we see within that debate access to bank accounts. Another is broader access to credit, obviously. Here, I was struck that we had seldom a confrontation of the tension between access to credit by choice versus abusive lending that is the product of coercion. And we must, as progressives, we must confront that tension. And we must be very clear about how we're going to navigate it. I'll talk about that a little bit later. I also would like to raise the question of why the fixation on credit. why can't we transcend that to focus on wealth accumulation for lower wage earners that does not consign people to debt traps? I've done a lot of my research on consumer credit, and I have finally decided that that is myopic, and I need to transcend that concern. In a related vein, but with a much broader lens, we've had a very, very rich continuing debate within banking law about regulation of banking or the financial system as a public utility. The interesting thing is this is usually treated as a monolithic concept, but in fact, in banking, there are shifting and very different rationales for calls for public utility regulation of banking. So here are just four, and I'm sure there are others. If we go back to the progressive era, of course, that debate was animated by concerns about economic concentration. In the United States, on some level, the banking industry has been relatively deconcentrated or unconcentrated compared to other countries. But if we look at concentrations of power in banking according to share of assets controlled by a small number of banks, that's when we really start to see the concentration. Another rationale is related, but perhaps a newer iteration, which is regulation of the banking system because money is a network, or money is a public institution. A third is due to both implicit and explicit public subsidies to private banking from federal deposit insurance and the lender of last resort. And then cutting across this, but not always linked to the larger conversation about money, are equity concerns about deposit harvesting from rural communities or underserved communities. The latter discussion about underserved communities often intersects with concerns about racial equity. So this conference has resulted in a number of calls for action, and this raises the question, how can we translate these goals into actual policies? I would say, and I was having this conversation with Jennifer, I think yesterday, that this is an ideal time to focus on this discussion. We are in a fallow period. It's hard to achieve a lot right now, but we have a presidential election coming up in 2 years. So this is actually a prime opportunity to map out, figure out how we're going to operationalize ideas and plan for action, especially in advance of the elections. So let me just take one example, calls for public utility regulation. As I mentioned, these calls have different justifications, and as we try to think about how to bring this to fruition, those justifications really matter. They matter, first of all, as to whether the idea of public utility regulation will capture the public imagination or be dismissed as too esoteric. So I think something that is extremely effective is to think about the traction that the call for Medicare for All has gotten in a relatively short time. And apply that here to bank accounts for all. Now we've seen a couple of very different ways of operationalizing that, one through postal banking, another through the Federal Reserve. But I think that call is something that can have legs and is already starting to get legs. Similarly, the type of justification will both drive the the policy intervention and limit it. And so addressing the harvesting of deposits leads to very different policy interventions from the moral hazard concerns arising from lender of last resort. And so we have to be, very clear about what outcomes are we seeking to put as top priority and as opposed to further out. In a similar vein, we need to be aware of when opportunities of windows of opportunity are opening and seize political moments while we can. So let me give you an example. If we go back to 2007, we saw in 2007 and 2008 the collapse of the private system of housing finance, which was the old private label securities system for financing subprime mortgages and similar toxic mortgages. And that was a real moment of opportunity because its collapse led to the virtually total replacement of the housing finance system with one that is government controlled. Now, this system is not without its flaws, and I have privately been very frustrated with aspects of Fannie and Freddie, but nevertheless, it has some really strong virtues that we want to preserve. So because most mortgages today are financed by Fannie, Freddie, and FHA, we have a very healthy standardization of mortgage products and of mortgage documents that we certainly did not have with the old private label market. We have an explicit affordable mortgage obligation that is imposed on the GSEs. We have a degree of public accountability that a private housing finance system will never have. And this, to me, the next thing that I'm going to say, I think is huge. We now have, by virtue of this system and many years of hard work, the institutionalization of meaningful foreclosure prevention obligations on the GSEs and FHA. Their servicers must use these procedures to help distressed borrowers stay in their homes. And one of the reasons that this is so big is that it's virtually impossible under U.S. law to discharge mortgage debt in bankruptcy. So this is a meaningful workaround and replacement of what otherwise is dysfunctional bankruptcy law for distressed mortgages. The implementation of these procedures is flawed right now, but it does create legal obligations that borrowers can fight to enforce. Now, in seizing these windows of opportunity, we need to find areas of common interest, and there can be some with industry, while exploiting internal divisions within industry and within partisan opponents. So, with respect to finding areas of common interest, the most powerful form of foreclosure prevention that is now an option today is reducing the principal owed on loans. That was a fight to behold. But finally, servicers and investors, through many, many years of just putting the statistics in their face, had to agree that they made more money cutting the principal owed on mortgages than on foreclosing on people and kicking them out of their homes. That was a hard-won fight, but we finally got industry to concede that. And here data was key. As for exploiting internal divisions, I'm going to borrow a leaf from the current struggle over the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and I'm just going to say the CFPB is going to survive. It's bloodied and bowed right now, but it's going to survive. But let me go back to exploiting internal divisions. Right now, there are multiple constitutional challenges in federal courts by industry challenging the CFPB as unconstitutional because it is headed by a single director. I am very, very nervous about these challenges, especially with the new constitution of the Supreme Court. However, the Trump administration, now in 2 circuits, has taken the position that the single director structure is constitutional, and the reason why is now that they're in power, they want the single director structure. So that the political the political forces in power in Washington right now are fighting industry on this, and they're fighting themselves to a standstill, and more power to the standstill. That's just great. Yes, thank you. So let me close with just a handful of thoughts about the challenges that lie ahead. The challenges are very real. Never underestimate the unholy alliance between Wall Street and the political apparatus. It has bottomless funding, and it is absolutely ruthless. When I landed as a naive professor in Washington, somebody took me out to dinner, somebody in the Obama White House, and said, remember, industry pays people full-time every day whose job it is to bring you down. Okay, so we have to remember that. Similarly, never underestimate the political power of bondholders. It is a force of nature. And they are very, very successful in promoting the moral discourses about personal responsibility of borrowers and promoting distressed borrowers as deadbeats. Okay, so that's always an uphill battle. And then finally, I'd like to hearken back to a point that Anna Gelpern made really eloquently yesterday, which is we need to be aware of how sweeping statements can be misappropriated by opponents and turned against reform. So, for example, a statement that bubbles can never be predicted in advance. Now, I think that's technically true, but that is such an unhelpful thing to say, because we can definitely, we know empirically in well-established markets, and this is certainly true for mortgages, what types of mortgage practices lead to buildups of risk that create markets. And we can identify those practices, we can identify the buildups, and we can regulate them to make sure that they don't build up. And we have, I'm happy to say. So we can't, the danger of a statement, bubbles can never be predicted in advance, is it becomes a smokescreen used by the other side for deregulation. We can't fall into that trap. Similarly, calls for access to credit. Again, I think that's so important, but we have to be very, very careful, because industry turns that into a code word for deregulation. We have to call for sustainable credit, responsible credit, not just any credit. And similarly, we have to be careful that the reforms we call for do not feed into the conservative mantra about consumer choice. That is a fig leaf, again, for deregulation. So I tend to be always the Debbie Downer. So on that note, I will conclude, and thank you so much.
I don't think this works. Thank you. First of all, of course, thank you very much, Chris, for inviting me to this conference, and thank you very much for giving me this task of trying to summarize this conference, which is basically giving me a headache because I'm completely deconstructed right now mentally after having been exposed to so many different ideas. So, you know, as far as I can tell, the fundamental theme that runs through all of the discussions during this conference is the theme of money not being just something natural or private, but being fundamentally a political phenomenon and a public-private hybrid phenomenon. And sort of what struck me as particularly interesting and kind of vividly demonstrated during this conference is the fact that money serves as this nearly universal and universally flexible and adaptable intellectual lens through which we can analyze a variety of issues, pretty much everything that that surrounds us as human beings. So we can talk about the financial system, the functionalities of it, and the dynamics and the operation, the pluses and the minuses. We can broaden the lens and talk about the kind of capitalist economy that we have, talk about capitalism. We can broaden the lens even wider and talk about the nature of the democratic polity or the absence of a truly democratic polity that we have. And finally, we can talk about about how we relate to one another as human beings and what kind of broader social order we have. How do we engage in reciprocal behavior or perhaps not engage in reciprocal behavior? And money is that interesting tool that is present all the way from my individual pocket, where I know exactly how much money I have and what it means for me, all the way to this sort of very abstract concept of what does it tell me about us as sort of a society of human fellows somehow. And of course, it is because of that complexity and the multi-level nature of money as an intellectual lens that the discussion during this conference is also extremely complex and multi-level. And we've heard discussions that sort of take place on this broad historical canvas, not only about the origins of money and the future of money, but also about the struggles at various levels that sort of accompanied all of these processes. We talked about money as a lever of political power, disenfranchisement, oppression, racial inequality, gender inequality, what have you. We talked about it as a tool of economic justice or injustice, as a tool of change. We also talked about money as ideology and even as language, which is an incredibly enriching way of thinking about money. So what do I draw from sort of listening to all of these discussions and all of these conversations? Well, first of all, of course, it is incredibly intellectually enriching. And the richness and the diversity of these conversations is quite amazing. And I think we really have to learn a lot from one another. And it is a wonderful idea to kind of open up these doors for us all to talk together. My only wish is that we probably should turn this into some kind of a year-long camp, a scholarly camp, where we all actually have the time and the luxury of delving much deeper into all these various aspects of this complex phenomenon. But on the other hand, I personally have experienced a sort of a slight sting of frustration at the inevitable level of fragmentation of the debate and the discussion, right? It is sort of fragmented precisely because it happens on so many levels, or it is taking place in many different rooms, to appropriate another sort of metaphor. And partly, of course, this is an inevitable result of our professional and disciplinary segmentation. We all are socialized in a particular way of thinking and talking about various phenomena, right? We have our own little professional sort of dogmas and idioms and sort of do's and don'ts. And sometimes it feels like we're all talking about the same thing, but in very different language, right? And in some sense, I sort of sometimes felt like we are, you know, how in that famous idiom of or metaphor of a lot of blind people trying to describe what an elephant is, right? Because we're all touching the elephant in different ways, and we're kind of, oh, that's exactly what this is. And sometimes we're probably even touching the same part of the elephant, but we just are conditioned to think about it in very different ways. So from where I stand, in my own little room, in my own little cave, right, from being a legal scholar studying financial regulation and design of financial markets, what I kind of struggle with is the sort of the range that is naturally there, and the temptation to either sort of talk about money and finance in excruciating detail, very technical, contextualized detail. In my case, that's the detail that comes from the law governing banking institutions and so on and so forth. But for example, in the case of a historian, that could be historical detail and so on and so forth. That's sort of one end of the spectrum. On the other extreme of the same spectrum, there is that possibility of kind of going hyper-normative, right? Almost go into this sort of normative slogans and sort of talk about the aspirations that we have for a better society and better human beings and so on and so forth. So what do? We have to find that Aristotelian mean, right, on that range. So I'm thinking that, at least to me, the task for me as a scholar is to try to synthesize as much of the institutional and contextual detail as possible, sort of to bring it more to the middle, but also to be very careful about operationalizing the normative, aspirational, slogan-like ideas that I share with many of you here in this room, right, and kind of to bring it all together. And so my colleague Bob Hockett and I, we've been trying to do exactly this type of work, trying to kind of to operationalize what that public-private hybridity means in the design of the financial system and financial institutions, and how we can actually envision a very specific institutional change in order to create these new ways of channeling money and channeling finance in the right direction. But to us, we sort of went from pure banking and kind of money into more kind of industrial policy and broader structural macroeconomic choices much more directly lately, thinking about the fact that to us the distributional sort of aspects of money, right, are in a way inseparable from designing sort of new ways of creating and ensuring long-term, structurally balanced and socially inclusive economic growth. So more to come. Thank you.
How's this? Okay, you hear me? Yeah. So this has really been a pleasure. I wanted to offer three thoughts also in conclusion. The first thought is about the goals of monetary reform projects, the kind of goals that we've been talking about in the last 2 days. The second thought is about the interdisciplinary nature of the work that is being done here. And the third thought is about the political aspirations of the people in this room. So the first thought that is about goals. I think the goals are extremely diverse. And this is something interesting. It's a very big tent, and there are many different monetary reform projects here. So I took up a quick kind of napkin scribbling inventory. So some of us are looking at the asset side of the financial system. And we're thinking about issues of credit distribution, and a little bit more on that coming soon. A lot of us are looking at the liability side. Okay, so we're looking at issues of access to means of payment. We're looking at issues of narrow banking. We're looking at issues of using the payment system to police acceptable and unacceptable economic activities. A lot of us are looking at the institutions of central bank independence. And even here, we have a huge diversity. So we have people who are looking at the goals of monetary policy. We have people who are looking at collateral frameworks. We have people who are looking at community development. We have people who are thinking about the regional politics of money in the context of complementary or community currencies, a whole other area, right? How do we create smaller monetary systems within larger ones? We have people who are working on what we might think of as the bread and butter of financial stability issues, how to prevent runs, how to make sure that consumer credit does not become predatory. And these issues, of course, have enormous distributive implications on top of everything else. We know that the consequences of financial crises are borne disproportionately by low-income households. We have people who are reconsidering what valuation means. So this could be thinking about the difference between price and value. This could even be things like reconsidering what the consumer price index means. So we have this huge variety. Of goals, and these are all candidates for concrete projects. So going back to I think a point that Pat made. Elections are coming up, and even if they weren't, it's the nature of elections that they come up occasionally, and these are all excellent. These are all excellent causes to be placed on platforms, and many of these causes could also be carried at a local level, or sometimes, as in the case of the Narrow Bank, through business initiative. Okay, so first thought about the conference: huge range of reform projects. Second thought: we have a huge range in terms of disciplinary backgrounds and where people are coming from outside of academia. Okay, so this conference is taking place at a law school, perhaps not the first place we would think of for this kind of conference. We're obviously in very deep dialogue with economists, some economists that we might think of as heterodox, other economies that we might think of as mainstream or neoclassical. We're obviously in a very deep dialogue here with historians. We're obviously in a very deep dialogue here with sociologists and anthropologists and political scientists. And there are people here who are coming as local activists. There are people here who are coming as financial sector practitioners. There are people here who are coming as government officials and central bankers. This is an enormous strength, I think, of the event and the kind of perspectives that it brings. And I think that's really a huge advantage of having a big tent. Third point, and that is the point about politics. This is not a traditional academic conference in the sense that many of the people here are not only pursuing knowledge for the sake of knowledge, although that is obviously important and that informs our political vision. I think many people here have agendas that they would very much like to try to bring into public discussion and try to see being institutionalized or legislated or practiced. Money is an extremely technical field, and I think that goes back to Saule and this idea that that we really could have a year-long camp where we talk about a lot of these issues in great detail, and I think that is that really goes to the very nature of the subject matter. I heard throughout these days, I heard several people mentioning, especially teachers, talking about how difficult it is to teach money and finance as thoroughly technical subjects that require a mental apparatus. So teaching balance sheets, that can occupy weeks of a curriculum, and a lot of times, again, depending on the kind of project you're engaged in, that is going to be absolutely crucial. I think what that means when we put these things together, the very wide range of goals, the deeply interdisciplinary nature of the work, and the fact that that at the end of the day, this is a normative project, and it's a practiced project. In other words, it's a project that, or many different projects that that we would like to see out there in the world. I think one of the things that means going forward is coming up with using the big tent as infrastructure, and coming up with some kind of structure where we can organize ourselves in smaller groups. A lot of times these smaller groups would probably be specific to one of the monetary reform projects, right? So I've mentioned half a dozen or so different projects, and there are many more. And it could mean people from all of these range of backgrounds, right? So academics from multiple disciplines, activists, practitioners, government officials, working together relatively closely in ways that sometimes we cannot do at a conference just by the nature of, a conference has a very particular format. So we have a platform, and we have somebody who speaks for 10 or 15 minutes, and then we have Q&A, and we have exchanges, and those could be extremely illuminating. They could it's a platform that generates a lot of insights, but we also need to have some institutional capacity for engaging in the kind of day-to-day nitty-gritty sustained work that I think a lot of these projects that people here are very, very excited about would need if we want to see them come to fruition, or even if we want to see them having a real chance. So I'll just conclude by saying there are different ways of doing it. One way is to start a bulletin, or in its modern variation, a Google Doc. So we can start a Google Doc, and we can talk a little bit about what different people want to pursue, and the ways going forward with that. So yeah, thanks very much. And do we have a little bit of time to open the floor? We do not. Okay. So, Chris. Yeah.
So I do think it's time to wrap it up, but I encourage the conversation to keep, to be generated in all sorts of ways. I wanted to say first, I want to thank two groups. First of all, I didn't do this by myself. It was very nice when people said, thank you, Chris. But I want to thank in particular Nadav, Roy, and Susan, and Rajiv, who and Nadav and Roy in particular are a kind of eternally constituted consult group and brainstorming group. I also want to thank Martin Drake, Dan Safransky, Dan Tarullo, and then the people who organized the panels, Sandy, Scott, all the people who initiated a panel. It was wonderful. Second wave of thank you goes to all of you. So I had 3 hopes for this conference. I think we all had 3 hopes for this conference, and they were only possible in the kind of convergence and confluence of this group. So here are my three hopes. They were actually nicely anticipated by our 4 panelists. First of all, I was hoping for, and I think the conference achieved a kind of common conversation. It seemed to me that people were doing all sorts of work that had some relation to each other, even though it's maybe an idiosyncratic or unanticipated relation. So So that's the common conversation that Nadav just mentioned, and we will do what we can to facilitate it. So if you haven't given your name, if you haven't written your name down and want to be on a mailing list, we'll make a mailing list, certainly a listserv out of the conference. We'll also keep the website going and maybe try to improve the website for those of you who had trouble getting onto it. The sessions were recorded. All the sessions were recorded, so we will post those when they become available, so that, you know, we couldn't all be in 3 places at once when we had to split up. On that note, the second hope for the conference was that we would generate spin-out conversations. So, it is true that we don't agree on everything, that there are many different reform projects, and in some ways the panels, when we had to split up, were representative of that there are different projects that are going on in those panels. And so we hope that you've found people to talk with and to work with as you move forward on those smaller or more specific projects. And the last hope I had actually came to me. I was out the other night with someone from the conference, and I went to the bathroom, and in the bathroom there was a sign that said, "All employees wash hands," and all the hands were up like this. We don't have the logo anymore. And I thought, yes, that's what I want. I want people to see money design decisions wherever they go. So on that note, I hope that you see money design decisions wherever you go.